Hey nerds, Todd Simmons coming back at you with a little more Toddomation. Today I want to do a video on Arista, more specifically Arista Wi-Fi or Arista Wireless, using the Arista CV-CUE platform, and that's CV as in Cloud Vision dash Q, Q-U-E. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So first things first, you're going to have an Arista account, which I've already logged into my Arista account. You can see it on the screen. In order to run the API calls, you're going to need to do a couple of things just to make sure that you have all the necessary parts. So the first thing that I want to do, once you log in to your CV-CUE, you should be at the dashboard, which is the main page, which is what I have showing right now. And specifically, you should see the dashboard, which is where you're at, and then this admin that I'm circling. If you do not see admin, that means that you do not have admin level privileges inside the Launchpad, which is where I am now. And that's what's going to give you access in order to create the API keys and tokens. If you don't have this admin here, you have to get with your admin to get you a key and a token. If you do, great. That means that we're ready to continue. So after you sign in, you're at your dashboard. The first thing that we want to do is we want to go look at this admin section. The admin section is going to show you all your admin users. I blurred mine out just because, I don't want all the admins to be seen. Inside the admin video, the next thing that you want to look at, I'm sorry, not admin video, the admin screen that you want to look at is this keys right here. And this is very important. This is where we're actually going to generate the keys necessary in order to be able to run the API calls. Now, once again, your login is going to need to be able to generate the keys and then have access to assign the privileges. It's very simple to generate a key as long as you have access. I'm going to show you here real quick. We would just click on New Key. It's going to ask you for the key name. This key name is just a name that identifies the key inside the dashboard. This name isn't going to have anything to do with the actual key, but just how you identify it. So I'm going to call this one Toddomation. Key. And then when I hit enter, it's actually going to create the key for me and then come back to this particular screen. By default, you'll notice that it says custom here as far as the key goes. Now, what I want to do is I want to assign the privileges that I have for this particular key. In order to do that, I'm going to set it to an active profile of admin by clicking on these three dots over here on the far right side, and then I can say service privileges. At this point, I can either automatically select each of the service privileges that I want it to have, or I can use the admin profile. As you can see, it just pretty much turns everything on, and then click Save down here in the bottom. Okay, change the save successfully. So if I go back to the keys and I look at it, you can see my Toddomation key is now set to admin. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to select this key here and then copy the entire contents of the ID, because you're going to need the ID and you're going to need the value. So copy this ID and then copy this value as well. And then we're going to put that into our Python file. So let's take a look at that real fast. So I have an example env file here. If you've seen my videos before, you'll notice that I like to use a secure method to hold my variables. That way I'm not sharing them with everybody. This could just be the .env file. Here we'll want to put certain things in. One, the type is going to be API credentials. That is mandatory. Okay, you have to specify that this is API credentials. There's other ways to do this, but the way that we're going to do it today is with API credentials. So we're going to have to put those API credentials in here. The key ID that you got from this screen over here on the side, you would put that here. And then, of course, the key value would go right under it. Okay, I'm going to use a default timeout of 900 seconds. And I'm going to use a client identifier, at least for mine, of Toddomation. This client identifier is somewhat unique to Arista. If you're using the same API key, but you're doing multiple things with that API key, or you're have different source software you can actually use this client identifier, and when you run your sessions, it'll append this client identifier. So if you were looking in the past of what particular program or software you were using, this client identifier can be used kind of as a value inside of a key to say, okay, which ones were Toddomation and which ones were done by some other program. Let's say you were doing something like this with Postman. You could put Postman here, or you could put VSCode, or you could put the name of a Git repository. Anything you want to do here with this client identifier. It's kind of a cool little tool that Arista has added onto their API call, so you can identify the source software, or kind of the version or the reason that you were running that particular API at that time. What I haven't shown you is this base URL. So the base URL is really, really important, because the base URL is going to tell you the first part of all your API calls. You're going to need this. So you're going to have to identify what your base URL is, and it's going to be different for every instance. Okay, so let's take a look at that real quick. So going over to base URL, in order to find that, you still have to be logged in to the portal, which we are. Okay, we have our information, so we've got our key, we've got our value. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead now and just delete that key, since everybody has seen the values here on the video. So I'm going to remove that key. Okay, and we can see it's deleted successfully. So in order to find out what your base URL is going to be, you're going to need to go to Dashboard. And you're going to need to actually sign in to your CloudVision. So after you sign into your CloudVision, you might have multiple tenants. If you do, down here on the bottom for services, it'll immediately pop up and ask you to select which service you want to use. So I'm just going to choose this Wireless Manager EFT. This is what we use to test new code when it comes out before we actually put it in production. So there's not a lot here, but it's not going to show you, my specific stuff. Once you get into this part of CloudVision, so you've loaded whatever tenant you're working on, we actually go down here and we click on System. And then from System, we want to go to Advanced Settings. So once we're in Advanced Settings, what we want to look for is this base URL. Now, there's a bunch of information in here, but the one that we're looking at right now is we want to look at this base URL for APIs. That's how you're going to get the URL that you're going to want to put in your Python code, because when you run things, all of the extensions for the APIs are going to be based on this base URL. No pun intended. So when I select it, you can see that there's going to be two options in here for my base URLs. So there's configuration and management, because there's two pieces to the APIs for Arista, and then there's these guest analytics. Now, this is just an intro with Arista CV-CUE and VSCode to get it going. So what we're going to be concentrating on is this configuration and management option that I have right here. So I would take this particular entry and just copy it out here. Okay, just a simple copy. And then I would come over to my env file and I would just put that right here. Okay, so now I've got my base URL that I'm going to use for all of the API calls. So yours is going to be different than mine, but just understand that all of the API calls that we make are going to have to lead with this. So when we go in and we look at the actual API calls in the directory structure associated with those, we're going to append what's ever in the API documentation to this base URL. Hence the reason I call it base URL. So looking back, we've now got our base URL. We have our API credentials, which we've specified. We've got the key here that we just pulled out of the key that we made. We've got that key value here that's going to be used. We got a timeout and we have a client identifier. So remember, this is just an example .env file. You would need to create your own .env file like I have right here. I've got mine. I just don't want to show my env file, but it is actually right here. This is what we're going to use for the Python-decouple. And what the Python-decouple does, and you can look at one of my earlier videos, it's just going to secure your variables in this .env file. So if you did share your code, you're calling from that file in a secure manner. So you're not actually sharing that with everybody else. So that's the env file. That's the basic setup. So let me go ahead and close this. And then let's actually real fast just look at the APIs themselves and how the structure is. I've got the URL up here for the filters, not the filters, I apologize, the API documentation. When you look at this, it's like any other API documentation. It'll specify, kind of what it is that you want to do with your commands. Now, right now, I'm only going to be working on get commands, just because the get commands are easy enough for you to set up and just start getting information about your Arista deployment. One thing that I do want to call out is when we're doing things, Arista has a mandatory field when we do things called the version. So let's just say we were trying to generate a session. I'm going to show you how to do this in a second. But when we look at the session information here and we click on this get, and it's going to expand this window down, notice there's a version here. Okay, and this version is important. If you don't have the version, you want to specify the version of the API call that you're making, and these can be different. So you see with the session parameter that I'm going to use here, notice its current version is 10, and this is a requirement. You're going to have to send that version ID with the other information when you go to make this API call. And this is going to be the same for all of them. So if we look, I'm specifying on the wireless manager. Remember, there were two links over there for the base URL, one for the wireless and then one for the guest. We're specifically looking at wireless in this video. So let's just say I go to APs and I look at APs and I say, here's the get APs. When I look at this get APs, I don't see the version. It's actually all the way at the bottom. And you can see in order to run this particular API call, you're going to need the version 12 to go in with this, and this is going to be part of the header that we're going to set up. Okay, so understand that when you look at this documentation, that here's all the filters that you can filter on, but there's typically with an Arista API call to CV-CUE, you're always going to have to send the version of the API call that you're attempting to make in with your headers, which means you want to make it part of your Python code. So let's go ahead and take a look. First of all, the session is really, really important because the session is what's actually going to give you the information to be able to run the APIs. So the first thing that we're going to look at is this post. So the post session is a requirement for you to get a cookie after the login using your key ID and your token. So let's go ahead and pull up the Python code for this. So I'm going to look at this Arista CV-CUE. By the way, this is all available in my GitHub in the Arista folder under Toddomation. Feel free to go over there and just kind of pull all this code down. I did create an example.env that you can put your information in, but obviously I didn't put my information in there. So starting out with the code over here, this is the base information that you're going to need. So like I said, I'm using Python decouple over here, and the Python decouple is just using the config method in order to pull that information from my .env. So here's what I'm pulling. I'm going to look for my base URL here. In addition to the base URL, I'm going to need a type. The type is going to be the API credentials that I'm using. Of course, the key ID that we just made, the key value that we just made, the timeout that I have, remember mine's set to 900 by default, and then the client identifier, which once again is just, if you're using it for different software or different applications or even different reasons, you can use this client identifier. You don't have to change it. You can just identify as yourself if you want to. Either one will work. Okay, so when I'm running these commands against Arista CV-CUE, the first thing I have to do is I've got to get a cookie. And that cookie is what's going to be used initially to go ahead and make all of these API requests. So you establish a session using the key ID here and the key value that we're pulling in, right, from our .env. So we're going to use this information. And I like to keep them as variables because then you can share your code. I'm then going to run this API, okay, using my URL, which my base URL is what I'm pulling in here. And then I'm just using the /session. So notice I'm adding that on using the F method. So I've got my base URL, a /, and then I've got the session. When I do this payload, and I'm making it a JSON payload using JSON dumps, that's going to just send that all the way through as my headers and my payload here. So I'm specifying the payload. This is the proper format. So when we look at how to use requests specifically to make this API call, this is just a variable. This can be anything that you want. I like to use response. A lot of other people do as well. Once again, I'm going to use the request.request. This is a post. So when you log in, you must do a post. This is the only post I'm going to do in this video. Okay. The URL is obviously just going to be the base URL plus session for this particular time that I'm adding right here. Okay. And then I've got my headers, which is just content application JSON is all you need. And then my data payload. This is important. Without this data payload right here, you are not going to get this cookie coming back. And if you don't have that cookie, it is not going to allow you to actually make a GET request. So this GET cookie method that I wrote has to be performed every time that you want to run this, or you just maintain this session or the cookie that you got to be able to run that. Once again, I'm specifying a timeout, so it's actually going to be valid for 900 seconds. You can make that any number you want. I believe the default is 3,600 seconds, which is an hour. To me, that seemed a little bit long. I didn't want to keep that session active for that long. Quite frankly, 900 seconds is a long time as well. So this is the basic format that we need to use in order to get that cookie back. Okay, so I have a couple of methods that I wrote in here for you. With this get cookie, I've also got the get session, the get locations, the get APs, and the get clients, just to kind of get you going with Arista CV-CUE. So I'm actually wrote this as just methods that I'm going to call in. Okay, this is the code that's actually going to call them. So a couple of things, if you've ever watched any of my other videos, you'll remember that I love ice cream, okay? Both kinds, the Python type ice cream, which I'm specifying here, and regular ice cream. But the ice cream is just a way to print to the screen using this IC method. I like it much better than print. If you want to use print, fine. The nice thing about ice cream is the way that it structures the print output works really, really well for me. So instead of just going straight into a debug, I actually use ice cream, okay? I'm trying to be more Pythonic in my ways, so I'm actually going to create a main method that I'm going to launch everything off of inside this Python file. And down here at the bottom, I'm going to just use the if name equals main. We're going to go ahead and run main. This is considered a Pythonic way to do things. Not all of my videos do this, but I'm trying to be more Pythonic in my attempts to write code. So we're actually going to run all of this information based on just running it through main. You don't have to do it that way, but that's how I wrote this one. So you'll notice a couple of things. I'm going to go ahead and, so we don't have that much into the screen during the video, I'm going to turn off a lot of this just by commenting it. By the way, if you're wondering how to comment very easily, it's just either the command and the / or the control / for a Windows PC. I'm on a Mac. So with the Mac, I'm using command and / in order to just comment all this out really, really fast. Okay. So the only thing that I have set now is in my default method that I'm using here underneath main is just this cookie equals arista.cookie. Now, you might be thinking, all right, Todd, where did you get this whole arista.getCookie? So the first file that I showed you was the Arista CV-CUE file. And that's where I wrote all of these methods. So you'll want to use that Arista CV-CUE. And I'm actually bringing that in as, right? So this is just creating a placeholder for me. So when I do Arista dot whatever, this method is actually going to be identified in the other file that I have. That's where I'm pulling that from. So if you look at if I open up this Arista CV-CUE here, you'll see that the get cookie is listed here, and that's how I'm pulling it using this arista.getCookie. Once again, you don't have to do it this way, but this seems to be a more Pythonic way to do things. This Arista, right, that I put right here, this can be any name that you want, okay? But it needs to match whatever the as that you have after the import. Once again, you don't have to call the Python file that I created Arista CV-CUE. You can name it any way that you would like to. Just remember, you've got to do an import on that, and you have to specify an as if you want. If not, then you have to call it with this, and it's just not as nice and not as neat. So let's look at it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create this variable called cookie. It's going to go run the get cookie. It's going to return this cookie to me real fast. If you're like, what do you mean cookie, Todd? It's actually the JSession ID right here. So when we log in using this post, because remember the login's a post, and it's going to take this key ID that we specified in this key value as your login credentials. As long as they're valid, it's going to return a JSession ID. That JSession ID is what we're going to use as a cookie, and it's just going to be a number or a string that gets returned that identifies this is a valid login, or a valid login was provided, and now this cookie is going to allow you to run those API calls. If you do not have this, it's not going to work. So let's go back to the Arista demo. As you can see, I've pretty much commented out everything except for this IC on the cookie. Now I'm going to go ahead and run the code. I'll just clear my screen. You know, that reminds me seeing that I did put a requirements.txt file in here, and it is on my GitHub, and it shows you the version of the packages, the Python packages that I've installed and that I'm using. So you can just do a pip install -r requirements.txt wherever it is, and it would install these particular packages if you don't already have them installed. I would recommend go ahead and installing them if you're having a problem, especially if you haven't installed the Python decouple. There's a decouple and a Python dash decouple. I do not use the decouple. I use the Python dash decouple, and that's where I'm getting all of my config statements here using Python dash decouple. As you can see, it's actually called decouple when you install it, so it's a little confusing. Okay, but I covered that in the previous video. So here we go. We're on the demo. I've got my terminal screen open. Let me just clear this to make it nice and clean. And then I'm going to run it. So what it's going to do is it's going to run this API call. Okay, and the API call that it's running is very, very simple. It's going to use the base URL that we've already talked about with session. It's going to take this payload, which I'm turning into JSON. Okay. So it's kind of like a KW args at this point, with the ** is how it's going to be sent up. Okay, and let's run it, and there it is. So there's my cookie that comes out. As you can see, it's a string of letters and numbers. That is the cookie that I would have used to run the rest of the API calls that I'm going to use. If you do not get a cookie back, that means that your login failed for some particular reason. And if it's failed, that means that your session was never established. And if your session was not established, then you're not going to be able to run any API calls. So this tells me, okay, I'm good. I was at least able to get a session. If you get an error running the APIs after this, it's quite possible that your session, your key and your token that you used maybe weren't authorized to do what it is that you were asking it to do. Because remember, this first one is a post. So that's it for part one of this, nerds. I'm trying to make my videos a little bit shorter. That way, you don't have to go through a 45-minute video. So that was getting CV-CUE and VSCode set up in order to run API calls. Now, I'm going to make some other videos just to show you some of the additional methods and functions that I wrote to show you some other things inside the Arista CV-CUE.py file. So stay tuned. You should be able to click on those shortly. As always, thank you very much for watching. Like, subscribe. I really like the subscribers. There's not too many nerds out there like us that are really interested in this, so I certainly appreciate subscribing. As always, if you have a comment, I will answer you. and then, maybe make another video depending on what it was that you were asking. So we'll talk to y'all later, nerds. Bye.